Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am going to introduce our CEO at Every Child, Laura Maines.
Thank you, Sid. Thanks to everyone for being here at our Parent Up February event. We really appreciate you taking the time to participate. We're really excited about the discussion that we have tonight, which is going to be talking about healthy relationships and healthy dating relationships for teens and tweens, and talking to them about safe dating relationships as well. So we are thrilled to have Dr. Maya Ragavan. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Dr. Maya Ragavan, who is an assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of Pittsburgh. She is also a researcher in violence prevention and health equity, and is passionate about helping caregivers and parents talk about dating and dating violence. Before we move forward and I turn it over to Maya, I want to thank our sponsor, NAMI, for all of our Parent Up programs. If you have not had a chance to listen to one of our programs, if this is your first time, we do encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and check some of them out. Our goal is to give parents and caregivers tools for some of the tough issues that you might face. Parenting isn't easy in the best of times, and this has not certainly been the best of times. And so we wanted to open up the toolbox that we have available to us through our staff and through the wonderful community partners that we have to give you some resources to tackle some of those challenges. So thank you so much for being here. If you have questions throughout, you can put them in the chat. We are monitoring the chat and we can ask them for you, or you can ask at the end. However you want to handle that is fine, but we're happy to have discussion as well. So with that, Maya, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Would it be okay if I can share my screen and then I can just, I can share the PowerPoint?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, great. Great. So I will, it's a small group, so feel free at any point to interrupt with questions or thoughts. So I really, really love this topic. One sec, let me just, do you see the presenter mode or the regular, just the screen?
We see presenter mode.
Presenter mode, okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
And so I love this topic so much. I love talking about this because I think it can be really, really hard for parents and for caregivers to help and support young people, both in recognizing healthy relationships and also for young people who are experiencing violence in their relationships. And so I hope I can provide a couple tips and tricks, and maybe we can have a good conversation about this as well. And so I like to start with what is dating, which I will say I do not really know the answer to that question. I have been told by many patients that dating is not a word that they use anymore, and that is not what people do. And so I think it's very, it can be a very broad term, and I think people define it in different ways. So hanging out, hooking up, just talking, just texting. It can be a group versus one-on-one setting, one time only, a long-term relationship. So really, it can be so many different things, which I think is what makes this work really complicated, because I think our views of what a relationship looks like for adolescents is not always aligned with kind of what their views are about their relationships. And so I think it's important to just remember the multiple ways that young people can be in dating relationships and what dating can look like, and also that they may not use those terms. And so I know all of you have had teenage children, and I'm sure that they use lots of different terms to describe dating. So I always like to start there. And I always think that it's important to start with what a healthy relationship is. And I know that this may seem very just, an interesting place to start, but I think more so than even what is dating violence, really what is a healthy relationship. And so these are some, signs of a healthy relationship. I mean, for all of us that are in relationships, we sort of know when it's healthy and when it's not healthy. And I think really, as you'll hear over and over again, the most important piece of an unhealthy relationship is power and control. And I think that that's really important. So the most important piece of a healthy relationship is trust, and honesty and respect. And I think it can be really helpful when you're starting these conversations to really start with what a healthy relationship looks like. And I'll give some suggestions later on, but this is a really nice infographic that you can share with your team, with your kids, about what healthy relationships looks like. I'll also point out the equality piece here, because as you'll see when I talk about unhealthy or dating relationships, much of it is really rooted in controlling behaviors. And so then when we think of adolescent relationship abuse, that's what I like to call dating violence, because like I said, dating is kind of a word that adolescents don't really use. And I also like to use the word adolescent versus teen, because as we know, young people are their brain is continuing to develop until they're 24, 25, 26. And so the way that adolescent relationships may look, even for young adults, is different than maybe what a relationship would look like, for an older adult. And so what is adolescent relationship abuse? So it's so many different things rooted in power and control. So there's different types of abuse. So you can have sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, economic abuse, cyber abuse, reproductive coercion, sexual exploitation. And these are just a couple of examples. And I want to also mention that, many times when we're thinking about something like dating violence, domestic violence, I think it's easy to think of, I think we often think of it as something that's just physical abuse, but there are so many different ways that it can manifest. And, and even something like sexual abuse, I mean, while rape and sexual assault are definitely very common, sexual abuse can also look like different things. So it can look like, texting pictures, it can look like, social media references. I mean, there's so many different ways that these types of abuse can manifest. And I will say this from time to time throughout. I mean, this is a very challenging topic, especially if you yourself have experienced any kind of violence or abuse in a relationship, or if you have a teenager who's experienced it. So feel free to, turn your speakers off if you need to take care of yourself. And I'll mention this a few times because this can be very challenging. And I think really the fundamental principle of all of this is adolescent relationship abuse is one person using a pattern of methods and tactics to gain and maintain power and control over a dating partner. And so really the challenging thing about it is this can happen in so many different ways. And so it can happen through finances. It can happen through immigration related abuse. I mean, there's so many different ways to maintain power and control. And so it's hard to really say, well, this is what dating violence looks like, because for every relationship, it looks a little different. But fundamentally, when it comes down to it, it's all about sort of power and control, and one person using power and control tactics over another person. And so this is the power and control wheel. So these are different ways that abusive partners may use power and control. And this is actually specifically for teens. So there's a lot of different power and control wheels. There's power and control wheels focused on immigrant survivors. There's power and control wheels focused on elder abuse. And this is focused on teens or adolescents. And so there's just a couple of examples of the ways that that abusive partners or people that use violence will try to assert power and control. So, intimidation, threats, sexual coercion, peer pressure. And again, like I said, there's lots of examples of how this can happen. And so adolescent relationship abuse is incredibly common, which I think is very distressing as a parent to hear. So 1 in 3 young people will experience dating abuse. So 1/3. It's a little bit hard to pinpoint an exact number because it really depends when researchers look at this, it depends on the types of abuse. So the more types that you include, the higher the percentage. And so some studies that have included multiple different types of abuse have found that up to 70% of young people who have dated have experienced some kind of dating violence or ARA victimization at some point in their lives. So it's incredibly high. And so this 1 in 3 is all young people. And, a lot of times people say, okay, well, is this, more high school students? And it is, high school students are more likely to experience, but some studies have shown that up to 50% of adolescents, like middle school students who have started dating have experienced ARA victimization. And so it's very common, unfortunately, even in middle school among young people who've started dating. And so dating violence is very impactful on child health and well-being. So it can decrease school safety, it impacts health and well-being. It can create opportunity, unfortunately, for experiencing partner violence in the future as an adult. And so it's unfortunately so impactful on child health and wellness. And I only put this here, this I think feels very kind of deficits focused and negative. I only put it here to show how much it impacts child health and wellness, and how much of how much of a responsibility we all have as parents, or me as a physician, to support young people. And so I think the good news is that parents and trusted adults are key in promoting healthy relationships and preventing ARA. And so some studies have looked at all different kinds of protective factors, and there are some that show that parents are the only protective, like they are the ones that really can protect. And so sometimes peers can be helpful, schools can be helpful, but parents are incredibly helpful in both promoting healthy relationships and preventing unhealthy relationships. And so the Centers for Disease Control has kind of a list of ideas that they have to prevent intimate partner violence across the lifespan. And you can see that the second one here is engaging influential adults and peers in family-based programs. So I think it's really, really important as parents. And so I'm going to take another pause and say, now I'm going to go into some sort of tips and tricks for how you can talk to your teenager about dating violence and conversation starters. I want to again say that this is very, very difficult, especially if you've experienced violence in your own relationship. So if you need any support with how to talk to your teenager about dating violence, especially if you've experienced violence in your own relationship, the Women's Center and Shelter can be very helpful. So this is their number right here. And so, like I said, parents are so important in protecting children against dating violence. And it's really, so I want to show this kind of, so the orange box is the most important piece of this figure, but it's very multifaceted what parents can do. So it's important to have conversations around dating violence, but that's not the only piece of it. I think the other piece of it is really parents knowing about their child's dating activities and children telling you about their dating activities, which is both of which are very difficult because, it is very natural and developmentally normal for adolescents to try to maintain independence. But as we all know, even though they're trying to pull away, this is a time where actually I think they need the most support. I mean, I have a 3-year-old, and I was talking to a colleague, one of my friends today who has 2 teenagers, and we were talking about, even though my 3-year-old needs me all the time, in so many ways, her teenagers need her all the time too, and need even more support than maybe what my 3-year-old needs. So it's a really, 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 I think, important time in terms of support. And so parental monitoring or knowledge about dating is very important, as is communication. And then the other thing is setting dating rules, so behavioral management. And I think that's one of the things that I really recommend, is that everybody sort of set rules around dating. And I'll mention in a second, it's kind of good to start them early on, to set the rules early on, so they're very clear and consistent. And so again, this is very, very hard. We know that teenagers don't want to talk to their parents about dating. They'd rather talk to their friends. And we know that it can be really hard as a parent to even imagine that your child is dating. I mean, it is very hard, I think, to imagine that they go from the little 3-year-old or 2-year-old to someone that's starting, to date and have romantic feelings. And so I think that it's okay to just remember that it's really hard. The one thing I say all the time is, check your heart rate first. When you're having these conversations, take a deep breath, know that it's probably going to feel a little emotional. It's going to feel a little stressful, and then sort of, dive in. And so I'm going to provide a few strategies that have been helpful for parents. Not all of them are going to be helpful for all of you. Some of them aren't going to work. Some of them may backfire. As we know, parenting is a lot of trial and error and hoping for the best, but some of them are helpful. So just some general ideas overall. So I strongly recommend including conversations around dating violence and sort of everyday conversations that you're having, and healthy relationships. And so, like I said, I think actually really uplifting healthy relationships is important. And is pointing out sort of where you notice relationships that may be unhealthy. And so I actually think a great time to do this is when you're reading or watching TV. because on TV, there are so many examples of healthy and unhealthy relationships. And so unfortunately, this example seems to show my age when I try to talk to teenagers about it. But one of the examples that I like to give about a TV show is the Mindy Project. And I don't know if anyone's watched it here, but if anyone who has watched it, the main character in that show was in a relationship that was where her partner was very controlling and would track her periods because he wanted her to become pregnant again, which is an example of reproductive coercion. Reproductive coercion is when somebody either in some way tries to infringe upon your reproductive rights, whether that's to try to track your periods or break condoms in order to get someone pregnant when they don't want that, or forcing them to get an abortion, or forcing them to be on birth control when they don't want to. And so actually it's a very classic example of reproductive coercion, and it's never really discussed. And at the end, she goes back to him because she loves him, and it's a very complex sort of relationship. And I think it's a good example, maybe not for younger kids, but for older kids, a good example of an opportunity to talk about the complexities of that relationship, to talk about the fact that I think so often people view kind of abusive partners as monsters and horrible, and sometimes they are, but in this particular circumstance, it was quite complex. And one thing that I like to say is oftentimes survivors of partner violence or dating violence, they want the violence to stop, not the relationship to end. And so I think that's a really important example there. And that's a good example where you can ask, when you're watching TV together, you can say, hey, like, what do you think about this? Like, tell me how you're feeling about this. Because it's easier, I think, for young people to talk about relationships they see on TV than to talk about their own relationships. I think it's very important to talk about respectful friendships. And so that can feel better to young people than to talk about dating relationships. So, if you can, and because, we all know that friendships can be very abusive as well. So you can sort of point out examples of what a respectful friendship looks like. I think it is really important to share your own thoughts on what healthy relationships look like. So I think it's certainly through, it can be done in so many different ways, but I think sharing what you think a healthy relationship looks like. So you think it maybe looks like this, and it looks like this, and this is why. I think focus on gender inclusivity and respect is very, very important. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but it's really important, both from the perspective of sort of thinking about sexism and how that impacts dating violence, and also from the perspective, if any of you have young people who identify as gender non-binary or transgender, unfortunately, due to things like transphobia and sort of other structural inequities, young people that are gender non-binary do experience more ARA victimization. So I think it's really important to think about that. And then I think always like thinking about social media. So I've got to admit, I am not a social media person. I sort of decided that I'm just not going to be on any social media, but social media is so pervasive and there's so many examples of relationships. I mean, I just think recently there was an Instagram or TikTok influencer who someone had said that person sexually assaulted another influencer. I think there's so many examples on social media that can either be used as examples to talk about dating violence or things to think about when you're having these conversations. And so I'm gonna just provide some conversation starters that you can think about for younger children. I think it's always good to start, what does it mean to be a good friend? So ask them like, who's their best friend, and who's a friend of theirs, and why are they friends, and what do they really like about that friend, and what, really getting at like a healthy friendship, because that I think is such an important foundational thing for young children to think about when they then think about unhealthy or healthy dating relationships in the future. I think it's also important to think about what we do when we're angry with our friends. And so this idea of like positive conflict resolution and coping skills. I am a huge fan of anything mindfulness related. And I do think that teaching like deep breathing and coping can be really helpful. I will admit that, there are a lot of young people that when they, due to trauma that they've experienced, they may become angry, and that may not be enough support for them. And then I think, having other support like therapists and other sort of coping skill support is really important. But I do think that talking about, okay, what should you do when you get angry with your friends? How can you stand up for yourself without sort of using anger or violence as a way to stand up for yourself, I think can be really helpful. I also think it's really important to discuss permission and touch. And so, I'm Indian, and my in Indian culture and other cultures as well, there's a lot of sort of like forced cheek grabbing and hugging and all this kind of stuff, and from older relatives. And I think on the one hand, like it's part of the culture, but on the other hand, like it is good to teach young children about, like, what if you don't want your aunt to like grab your cheeks or like hug you, to really think about like that it's their body, and that they should be able to say, no, I don't want that, because then that will help them later understand sort of a little bit more about consent and bodily autonomy in the future. And so now conversation starters for middle school students. So middle school is where I really like to start thinking about dating and healthy friendships. And so I think it's good to just start with, what do you think about dating overall? And maybe this is, again, something from a book or a TV show, or you just start this conversation. Ask a little bit about their friends. What are their friends doing? Are they going out on dates? It's always easier for people to talk about what their friends are doing compared with what they're doing. How do you know if you want to go out with someone? How do you know if you like someone? And then I think this is where you really talk about, like, what does a healthy romantic relationship look like? So I think especially for middle school students, talking about the good stuff, the strengths, the healthy part can be really helpful. And it's really positive and strength-based. And maybe even like, tell me, like, from, the TV shows you're watching, what's like a really healthy relationship? What does that look like? Tell me an example. I think that that's a really great place to start. And this is where also you can start to set family rules around dating. And sorry, this should be around, my apologies. This should be, what am I doing? This should be around dating, not dating violence. What should the family rules be around dating? And I'm going to admit this is very hard. I mean, kids like to break rules, but I do think if there's some buy-in around the rules, and I mean, you're a parent, you're the parents, and so you set the rules. And so I think, but really being clear, like, in this house, this is what curfew looks like. This is what dating looks like. This is what we're doing, can be really helpful, especially in middle school, kind of when kids are starting to get interested in dating, but haven't necessarily started dating yet. And then conversation starters with older teenagers. So this is where I like to start getting into more unhealthy relationships. So this is where you can start to ask about unhealthy relationships at your school or with your friends. What would you do if one of your friends was in an unhealthy relationship? First, because that helps you figure out what they would do if they were in an unhealthy relationship, but it also teaches bystander skills. And so one of the things that I like to talk about when I'm talking with parents is it can be helpful to ask your kid, what would you do? And really emphasize with them the importance of listening to their friend, supporting their friend, validating, what their friend has been through. And that can be helpful then for them, for their friend, for your child as a bystander, and it also helps you kind of think through their thought process of what they would do if they were in an unhealthy relationship. And then also how to break up. And so this is a really interesting thing, and people don't really talk about this much, but I just finished a study where we were asking about different conversations that parents and adolescents had, and one of the least common conversations was how to break up. And that's really important, right? Because I mean, some adolescents, every adolescent relationship is a little bit different, but chances are, at least one point, you'll want to break up with someone, or they'll, and so I think talking about how do you end a relationship is great. And also kind of that when it comes to dating violence, some of the most unsafe times can be when somebody tries to end a relationship. And so I think really making sure that your kids know that breaking up, or can talk through how to break up, that you can be there if they need to break up and feel unsafe. But I think that that's a really important piece that gets missed that I think is helpful. I also think that this is a good time to start thinking about, I don't think I talk about this as much in this presentation, but I also think at older teenagers is a time to start thinking about kind of the interweaving between sexual health and dating violence. So like I said, things like reproductive coercion and that as well. And so I think it's important to think about online relationships, because especially during COVID, I mean, kids are spending so much more time online. And I think that it's very important to think about different types of online relationships. And so these are some of the sort of suggestions or what's the right word? These are some of the ways that teenagers may be harmed in online relationships. I think online relationships are very, very, very hard. I have had families and patients tell me about, them being in an online relationship where the person says that they're 17, but who knows, and they've never met the person. And I think it's just really important to remember that that can happen as well. And that I think and that it's important to talk to your teenager about online relationships. There's some really good internet and social media literacy courses that you can do with teenagers, especially middle school. That's the right time, I think, to start this. And so I think that that's really important to consider as well. And then just a couple of myths as well. And so we sort of talked about this. And so here are some signs that your child may be in an unhealthy relationship. I will say these are definitely these are common, but these aren't the only signs. I think one of the other things that I think is very important is there's a lot of stalking and dating violence. And so particularly like if they don't want to leave the house, or they're really nervous about giving up their phone, like if they don't want to leave their phone around, things like that can also be helpful to clue you in. But sometimes it's really hard to know. And so these are some examples, but they're not the only examples. And so these are the things that you may hear. And so these are the things, like if you're hearing your teenage child saying this about their partner, that this could be abusive. If somebody says they want to get serious really quickly, don't take no for an answer, and you're hearing kind of your child saying, no, like I don't want that, but like they still do it anyway. Isolation from friends is the number one thing abusive partners do, right? Because and from family. And so one of the things that I've seen is abusive partners will say, your mom is this, your dad is this, your parents are this way or that way, or your friends are this way or that way. And I think isolation it's really, really important if you start to notice that, to be concerned. If you're hearing, if you ask your kid to go out to dinner and they say, I have to check with my boyfriend first, I mean, that's really concerning. And then here's some other examples as well. I think one of the things that I've seen a lot, and it doesn't happen all the time, but is a lot of texting and a lot of sort of engagement, like, oh, I always want to be with, I always want to be with this person. I always need to be with this person. Because that is sort of a way that that abusive partners isolate dating violence survivors. And so these are some things, if you hear, to be concerned, to start to have conversations. And then, I mentioned this before, but I really think this is really critical, because oftentimes people will ask me, well, who is perpetrating and who is a victim of violence? Is it gendered? And I think it's a really complicated question. So most of the research has used a gender binary framework. And I think it's very important to mention that almost every study, I guess I won't say, I'm not sure about every single one, but most of them show that, like I said, because of things like transphobia, young people who are gender non-binary or transgender are more likely to experience ARA victimization. And so that is very, very important. I also like to mention that so much of the gendered nature of this work is very much rooted in sort of sexism and toxic masculinity. So young cisgender girls do use violence, but it's quite complex. And there are some folks that use kind of this term mutual aggression. And I don't really like that term, because I don't think it gets at the gendered nature of dating violence, and sort of the ways that sexism and toxic masculinity sort of permeate through. And so, yes, young girls, young people who identify as women can use violence, absolutely. But I also think it's important to remember that so much of dating violence is rooted in power and control, and is rooted in sort of toxic masculinity and sexism. And so this is this is a slide focused on kind of what I had already talked about transgender young people and gender non-binary young people. And so we talked about this already. And so, okay, so what do you do if your child tells you that they're experiencing dating violence? So I think the most important thing is really validation. And I have this slide up here, but I'm gonna go to this slide because I always say, first thing is check your own heart rate. I mean, I don't have a teenager myself, but I can imagine if my son told me that they were experiencing or using violence, the first thing is like my heart rate would shoot up and I would be like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And so I think, even when I talk to pediatric residents and people in clinic and someone says something like this, I say, okay, check your heart rate first, take a deep breath, take care of yourself. If you can't have the conversation at that moment, that's okay. And then I always say the next thing is to listen and validate, which is very difficult to do. I mean, it's hard as a parent because you just want to fix it, right? I mean, like this is your baby, they're going through something. All you want to do is fix it. And you can help fix it. But I think first is really focusing on like just listening, thinking, either thanking them or telling them like, it was so brave of you to tell me that. And I think really emphasizing how it's not their fault. And so when I have these conversations in clinic and I'm trying to support a young person and telling their parent about this, I think the one thing they're the most worried about is their parent is going to blame them and say, especially in situations where they aren't allowed to date and say, oh my gosh, like they're going to say it's my fault that this all happened. And so I think just normalizing that this is not their fault is really, really important. And then discussing the ways that your young person wants your support, that your kid wants your support. This is tough because I think someone may say, your kid may say, I'm just going to keep, going in this relationship. And part of the balance of being a parent is, stepping in and knowing that, they are still still developing and they're still children, and also trying to give them autonomy and confidentiality as they gain their independence. So it's a really important balance. But I think it's good to at least ask, like, how can I help support you? I think it's important to discuss harm reduction strategies. And so harm reduction strategies can really look like, do we need to get you a new cell phone number? What are the ways that this person is, using power and control tactics, and how can we reduce harm? And then I think it's important to remember that you're not alone. So there are a lot of really great resources for parents and for adolescents who are experiencing dating violence. And so you're not alone. And I think, even with harm reduction strategies, like you and your child can call one of the dating violence helplines, which I'll go through in a second, together and, talk it through together, and they can kind of help with harm reduction strategies. So I think it's also important to remember that you can be the parent and not have to be the expert in dating violence. Like the experts in dating violence can help you with that. And you can just be the parent and you can be there to support and guide. I will say one of the questions that people ask me all the time, and there's not a lot of great resources, is what do I do if my child is the one using violence? And I think really it's a lot of the same, but also really, really trying to speak with them about what they're doing, sort of why they're doing what they're doing, and how harmful it probably, it is. I think that's really hard though, because I actually don't think there are that many. I'm sure there are some great resources out there, but not a ton for parents on what to do if your child is using violence. And there's high rates of using violence in adolescent relationships as well, or perpetrating violence. But I think it's really sort of similar things with really kind of getting at where these ideas are coming from, and how to sort of support your young person in dismantling these ideas rather than like sort of validating them. So here are some resources. This is for adolescents. So there's some great online resources. So That's Not Cool is a dating violence website. It's got lots of wonderful resources. Lovers Respect is actually a hotline. It's a helpline. It's a national helpline. So you can call them if you need support. There is some resources on contraception. Young Women's Health and Young Men's Health are excellent health websites, but they have good information about dating violence as well. And then the Trevor Project is specifically for trans and non-binary folks. And then there's some texting and call lines as well. And here are some resources for you. So That's Not Cool and Love is Respect have good resources for parents. HealthyChildren.org is the American Academy of Pediatrics website, and they have some good resources. And then I very strongly recommend the Start Strong Parent website. It's a website specifically focused on parents. And if you really want to go in depth, Dating Matters for Parents is a 6-session. It's 3 sessions that you do that are just for parents, and then 3 sessions that are like activities you can do with your adolescent that really go into like the nitty-gritty of dating violence, if you want to do that. And then online safety. So internetmatters.org is really good and has a lot of great online safety and like online literacy tools. And then these are some of the Pittsburgh-based resources. So the Women's Center and Shelter is great with domestic and dating violence. Pittsburgh Action Against Rape, if your young person is experiencing sexual assault, trafficking, rape, and then Crisis Center North and Center for Victims are other great resources as well. So that is the end. I'd love if anyone has any questions or reflections, that would be wonderful.
I always start talking when I'm still muted, always. After all this 2 years of this pandemic, I still can't get it together. That was really so helpful. I do have some questions, but I want to give folks in our audience a chance too. So if any of you have questions that you want to put in the chat, I cannot see the chat, I don't think. Oh wait, yes, I can. Sam said, wow, this was so informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things I did want to ask, you had mentioned that 1 in 3 young people will experience dating abuse or violence. That's really a shocking number. Do you have a sense of, because I think that's higher than adult relationships. I'm thinking, right?
It's similar to adult relationships.
Is it?
So one of the hard things about the numbers is it really depends on what you're asking. And like, so some research will ask about just past year versus lifetime. Some will look at physical only, sexual only, psychological. So it's very similar to adult. It's very similar to adult relationships, maybe a little bit higher. Yeah.
Okay.
Depending on the study.
And has it been pretty consistently at that rate? Are we seeing any spikes in violence, or is there a spike in, I guess rather than violence, I'll say abuse, because certainly there's a sort of sliding scale, right, of what's happening. But are you seeing any increase in adolescent dating abuse, particularly over the last couple of years, either because of the pandemic or before that? What trends have you noticed, if any?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There hasn't been a lot of research that has looked at, there's been a lot of research to look at adult domestic violence and trends during the pandemic, less so about dating violence. There's some, anecdotally, some people have said that it's less dating violence during the shelter in place because a lot of young people weren't like leaving the house. And so they were at home and they, others have said different things. I will say, I think it's a hard question. So Healthy People 2030 says that overall dating violence rates are increasing. I think it's a really hard question because I think something like social media abuse is increasing, right? And then if you look at things like physical abuse and sexual abuse, it's holding pretty steady, but also it depends on like what measure you're looking at. But, I think as technology has changed, people are finding new ways to control. And so I think it's such a hard question to ask because there's so many different ways that this can show up. Like there's so many different ways that people can be in unhealthy relationships. But definitely, things like cyber abuse and sort of using technology and social media, I think has definitely increased. I think, young people having their own cell phones has made it easier to like stalk and track, just like I guess at the beginning you were saying, it's that you don't just have the landline anymore to call, right? And so it's a little bit harder to monitor. So I know that that's like not a straightforward answer, but I think in general, yes, I think it is kind of going up, but I also think it really depends on what type of abuse, and there's so many different ways that it can manifest.
Right. We do have another question too. What do you do if your child just won't engage at all in a conversation around dating? I know I have some adolescents in my family that would be horrified to have the conversation. What suggestions do you have for trying to soften that landing a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. I mean, I think sometimes talking about like healthy friendships is good, and then just hope it kind of permeates through to the dating, because I think kids are much more willing to talk about their friends than they are about dating. I think if they don't engage, it's actually such an interesting question because there is I think it's not quite clear to me that I think the conversations are important, but I think what may actually be as important, if not more important, is the monitoring piece. And that's the thing that, I mean, look, I don't have a teenager, so I'll let you know in 10 years how all this works out. But But I think that a lot of it is the monitoring piece. So it's really kind of trying, like, trying to like find little ways to sort of see if you can kind of monitor what they're doing and when and who they're with and whatever ways that works for you. But I think maybe healthy friendships, if they won't engage at all, doing monitoring, maybe talking about dating rule setting, maybe they'll engage then when you start setting rules, and they'll be like, they'll engage with you then because they will want to push back against the rules. That could work as well. Sometimes talking about what their friends are doing. And then, if really they won't talk to you at all, which is really, really hard. And I'm sorry for anyone who's going through that. Maybe figure out which adult they will talk to, right? Like maybe it's not you, maybe it's another co-parent, maybe it's an uncle. I mean, maybe it's just an adult, a trusted adult who you trust, and maybe sort of allow them to take over that, that piece of it. Because I think, it's parents and caregivers are so important, but if there's another trusted adult, like a teacher, a coach, I mean, that can be really helpful if they really won't engage at all. So just a couple of thoughts. Wow,
no, that's that's okay. That's a great suggestion. Because my question is sort of around not necessarily not engaging, but kind of making that determination developmentally where an adolescent is, because I know there's sort of it runs the gamut among the adolescents in my life, certainly, that there are some that are really gung-ho and excited about dating and have that as a girl have male friends, some of whom there may be some interest there, and so they're really looking forward to it. And then there's the other end of that spectrum where it's just not on their radar at all. And judging, like, is it not on their radar because they're not interested, because they don't know how to sort of engage in that in that dating process, and making so I guess as a parent, how do you sort of, what do you look for developmentally to say, okay, now it's important to have the conversation, and I hear you, I'm laying the groundwork at middle school and even younger with conversations around healthy relationships. But then how do you address it, especially I think in maybe upper middle school and high school, where there may be some peer pressure around whether you're dating, who are you dating, and knowing where your child is developmentally in terms of what they want and what's appropriate without pushing. Does that, I'm not asking this very well.
No, it's a real, and it's such a good point. I mean, we know, right? Like, I mean, there's some 11, 12-year-olds that are like really excited about dating, and there's some that still think that, whatever has cooties. And so, I mean, I think it's very, very, and I mean, I think I would trust your gut. I mean, your kid more than anybody else, and you kind of know how they feel about it. I mean, I think it would be a good opportunity to just bring up dating and see what their reaction is. I mean, I think what I have found, like even in clinic when I talk to all 11 and up about dating, like some of them are like, gross, and some are like more kind of like, they don't want to talk about it. And I think it's when they're like so openly grossed out by the idea. I think I feel a little bit like, okay, they're kind of like getting there, but they're not quite there yet. I think it's when like they're like, oh wow, okay, you're asking me this, when I know that that's something they've been thinking about. I think it's also really important, and this is it's so interesting. My parents are from India, and fairly conservative around dating, at least when I was growing up. I think they've changed a lot. So they like just never ever talk to us about it ever. Like they just were like, whatever, like you can't date until you're married, type of thing. And there's some, I'm sure, so many people, and I am not at all saying, every family should do what they feel right about. But I think it's so interesting because I really think so in so many ways, like dating is a very normative teen activity. And so I think, normalizing it is helpful. And I think can also open up teenagers to make them feel like, okay, my parents aren't going to get mad at me if I talk to them about it. Now, I think like, dating is a normative teen activity, but I think also like staying out until 2 a.m. with your boyfriend is not a normative thing, like you can set the rule about that. So there's a balance, but at least like if you come out and talk about it, especially if they kind of shut down. So if you're like, oh, if you're not sure and you're like, oh, tell me, how do you think about dating? And they're like, like I think talking about dating rules, bringing that up and really expressing like, okay, this is something that you're going to go through. Like, we get it. We went through it, can kind of open the door to make them feel a little bit more comfortable with opening up. So just a couple suggestions, but sometimes you can just tell by bringing it up where they are on kind of that spectrum.
Yeah. And do you have suggestions around, because I thought you made a really, really good point around talking to your adolescent about how a relationship ends, whether they, presumably if they want to end it, how they want to end it. And this is, I'm asking this more broadly. So regardless of, obviously there are serious safety concerns if there's adolescent dating violence in there, but there's also just in general, it's just really hard. It's really hard to break up with someone. It's really hard to be broken up with at any age, but certainly at that time frame too. And I feel like if your dating pool is smaller, right? If you're dating within your high school or your youth group or wherever you might be, whatever the pool might be, it's also public in a way that as adults we can sort of end relationships and do it in a private way. What suggestions do you have for parents to help teens and adolescents navigate that process, whether they are the ones breaking up or they have been sort of broken up with, around, maintaining boundaries around contact, et cetera. I always hear, and in fact have given my friends this advice over many, many years, like cut off all contact, right? Like you just can't, don't be looking at old pictures, don't text them late at night, all of the things that you're supposed to do that can be much more difficult to manage when you're an adolescent and still in that, going to class every day with that person. Do you have suggestions for that?
That's such a great question. I don't know if I have good suggestions for that. I think, I think it's really hard. And I think part of what's so hard about it, right, is like, there's this spectrum between you want to teach them to respectfully break up with someone. So you don't want like, we don't want our kids to just text like, okay, see you later. And that's that,
Right.
But in situations where there is dating violence, where there is power and control, sometimes that is what you need to do because, I've had patients and folks tell me that, their boyfriend sends them videos, crying, things like that. And so I think it's really, really hard. And I think part of it is really, if you have a sense of what the relationship was like and whether there was those like power and control behaviors, I think it's helpful. You can kind of guide your kid on like how to break up, because I do think, there's something to be said about breaking up in person and being very respectful about it. Like, I think that's really important. But I think in situations where there's that aspect of control and power, even if there's definitely situations where I think, a young person may not be safe when they're breaking up. And I think that's a whole different thing. But even in situations where they feel safe, like I think there's some times where it may be needed to sort of just cut it off and do it, in a way that's not face to face. So those kind of like cycles of power and control can continue. So I think it really just depends on what the relationship was like. And I think that's why, I think it's also really important that I think if you're having these conversations and your kid is opening up to you even just a tiny bit about their relationship, you can get a sense. But if you're seeing some of these power and control tactics, I don't know if I would use the same breakup strategies as if you're not seeing those power and control tactics.
Right.
Especially, I've heard people say that like, oh, my parents like, made me go to their house and like break up with them in person. And like, that can be very, harmful and just perpetuate these cycles of control. So, I don't have a great answer because it really just depends. But I think if it's a controlling relationship, I think it's really important to focus all the energy on how do you sort of extricate them from that control? How do you make it so they're not getting sucked into the kind of those like cycles of control? So it's a great question. It's actually, I think, there aren't so many resource guides and resource sheets available for parents on breaking up. It's one of the things that I'm working on with some of my research, because I think it's such an important piece of all of this. And so, but when I come up with stuff, I'll share it. But these are just some suggestions to start.
Yeah. Well, I think we see that too, because it's I don't know that adults are always that great at breaking up, right? So it's obviously, it's a skill that we don't learn, and we don't learn well, or at least a lot of us didn't learn it well. And so, the whole phenomenon of ghosting people and all of that, I mean, it really speaks to just not having those challenges in around communication and boundaries in those types of relationships.
Yeah. And there may be certain circumstances in a really heavily abusive relationship where ghosting someone is the absolute right thing to do.
Right.
So,
right.
I think it really just depends. And I think talking through what the breakup process looks like and why they've chosen the strategies that they've chosen can be really helpful as well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's really fair. I once ghosted someone because they only owned one CD. And I thought, how, like, we have nothing more to talk about. I don't recommend that. That was not the kind way to do it. But do you have suggestions or maybe some guide rails around, because I really hear you around adolescents they don't refer to it as dating, right? Hanging out, hooking up, all of the things. Sort of from a developmental perspective, like wearing your hat as a pediatrician, do you have a sense or some guide rails that you could offer to parents and caregivers around kind of what a healthy relationship at a particular, like in 8th grade might look like versus what might be healthy, in 11th grade, and what that might look like in terms of things like privacy for your child in their relationship, right? And then also, time, what does time spent together look like? What level of engagement with family, with friends, because I imagine it shifts over time, and that, maybe going to the movies and your parents are there too, and sitting in a different part of the theater when you're in 7th or 8th grade might be good, but when you're in 11th grade, that gets weird. And so that, how as a caregiver, do you know, like, what, I guess guardrails would probably be the best way to put it. Like, what are some guardrails or guidelines to keep in mind when making those family rules that families need to talk about?
Yeah, no, and I'm not sure if there's like a right answer, and every family may be a little bit different in this, but I agree. So I think that in middle school in particular, I think that it's really important to sort of do more of the group dating, and then having parents in the nearby vicinity whenever possible. I mean, frankly, if that feels like the right fit, depending on how you are as a parent later on, I think that's okay as well. But definitely in middle school, I agree. I think like the group dates, and then really setting like pretty clear curfews of when you're going to come home, and not like, extending it. So it's also shorter periods of time. And then I think as young people get older, like, I mean, there's some normative things that happen, right? They learn how to drive. I mean, there's all these things where they are gaining more and more independence, where I think there's a piece of it that that we also have to relinquish a little bit of control. I will say, though, that there are certain things that no matter what, I mean, and frankly, even an adult relationship is not like a respectful and healthy relationship. So I think, like, for example, if you want to have dinner with your child and they, and like, it's a family dinner, and they say no because like they have to meet their boyfriend because their boyfriend's going to get mad. I mean, I don't know if it matters 8th grade, 11th grade, or frankly, even me now, I mean, that is not rooted in sort of a healthy and respectful relationship. And I think the levels of engagement, I actually think that this can be really helpful, because if you feel like, I think so much of what we want to teach, children, and how we probably feel, is that your identity is so much, right? Your identity is, or your student, you're a daughter, your son, you're so many, you're whatever, you're so many different things. And being somebody's partner is just one of those things. And if you feel like your child's identity is being fully wrapped up, no matter what stage developmentally they are, is being fully wrapped up, that can be really challenging. But of course, the caveat to that is also, when people first start dating, they do get fully wrapped up because it's a new exciting thing. So I think I think if you're worried about it, I would recommend saying, oh, it's family dinner tonight. We're doing family dinner. You need to not see him for one one day and see, I mean, see, is it a reaction like, oh my God, I'm like so angry, you're like ruining everything? Or is it a reaction of like, oh my God, like he's going to get so mad. Like, this is such a bad, I think that can be helpful. But yes, I think overall kind of the more group date stuff that, middle school and as they get older, I think it's okay. It's okay to sort of whatever feels good for you, moving curfews and so forth. But I also think there's some things that sort of transcend when it comes to power and control relationships.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful.
Sure.
Does anyone else in the chat or even not in the chat in person, if you want to ask a question, any other questions for Maya? Give it another minute. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So thank you so much. This has been incredibly helpful. Especially, I mean, I think you really included some good tools that parents can use tonight. As we saw one of the comments in the chat, that they can use tonight when they're watching TV with their adolescent to start a conversation. It's so important. And so we really appreciate your time. I want to again thank NAMI for their sponsorship and support of our Parent Up program. Our next Parent Up will be in April, and we'll be sending out more information on our social media platforms. So we would encourage everyone to just pay attention to that and sign up if it's something that's helpful. If there's anything that you missed in this conversation or something that you'd like to go back to, we will have it available on our YouTube channel to watch and share in perpetuity, hopefully. But this was incredibly helpful, Maya. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, of course. And I wanted to mention that I am working on some research on this topic, and I'm always like trying to interview parents about their thoughts. And so I may, if it's okay, Jamie and Sadie and Laura, I may just send a quick email to you guys to forward to folks. And it's, of course, just if you're interested,
Definitely.
But I'd always love to hear your thoughts on this to try to develop some, because I'm always working to try to develop better resources for parents. So I'll put my email in the chat. I think